My name is Gerald Lawson. I am 70 years old, and for the last decade, I quietly funded my son's illusion of being a self-made millionaire. Last Thursday, as I recovered from a minor stroke, he slammed a stack of my physical therapy bills onto a restaurant table and told me to stop wasting his money. He demanded I sell my home and check into a state-run facility so he could expand his business. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply wiped my mouth, paid the tip, and walked out. That night, I revoked his access to the reserve accounts. My trust actually moved the disputed funds into documented attorney-controlled escrow, packed a single duffel bag, and vanished into the night. The morning, the reserve balance available to him was zero, and his luxury life was about to violently crash down around him. If you have ever given everything to ungrateful children only to be treated like a burden, hit like and let me know where you are listening from. Now, let me tell you exactly how I dismantled his world. The ice in my water glass had barely melted when the thick manila envelope hit the glass table with a sharp, disrespectful smack. Several diners at the surrounding tables in the upscale steakhouse glanced over, but my son Trevor did not care. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms in that tailored Italian suit I had silently paid for. "You are bleeding the company dry with these useless physical therapy sessions, Dad," he hissed, his voice low but laced with absolute venom. 3 sessions a week, specialized massages. Stop wasting my money. I just sat there, my right hand still slightly trembling from the stroke I had suffered 2 months prior, looking at the son I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise. Next to him, his wife Monica adjusted her designer purse, rolling her eyes, as if my mere presence was an exhausting chore. "Trevor is right, Gerald," she chimed in, using my first name with that familiar, condescending tone. "You are 70 now. You do not need a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, and you certainly do not need luxury medical care. We found a highly affordable assisted living facility upstate. If you sell the house and hand the capital over to Trevor, he can finally open his 3rd warehouse. It is time you stop being a financial drain and actually contribute to this family future." A financial drain. The words hung between us with a cruelty Trevor did not seem capable of hearing. The logistics company had begun with $2 million from my retirement portfolio, but I had not simply handed Trevor a personal gift. The capital had been placed in a Lawson Family Holdings reserve account, owned by my revocable trust. Trevor received written authority to draw from that reserve for approved business expenses while he built the company's credit. He was also an authorized user on a separate household support account that covered several expenses I had voluntarily paid for him and Monica. That arrangement made me the source of the money, not the owner of every dollar the operating company earned. It also meant Trevor could not truthfully call my physical therapy a drain on his funds. My rehabilitation was being paid from my own medical account and insurance. Payroll and ordinary vendor accounts were separate. I had spent 40 years building a freight business from a single rusted truck. I had given Trevor capital clients and the benefit of my name because I wanted him to create something worthy of the opportunity. Instead, he spoke as though my sacrifice proved his brilliance. He expected an argument. He expected me to beg for permission to keep my home and continue treatment. I folded my napkin, left a $100 bill for the server, and stood. Trevor ordered me to sit down. I kept walking. The son I remembered had disappeared behind entitlement and greed. For the first time, I understood that protecting him meant I had to stop financing him. The drive home was quiet. When I entered the house I had built with Evelyn, it no longer felt safe. For months, spare keys had disappeared, and drawers in my study had been rearranged. I had blamed the stroke and my age. That night, I went directly to the steel safe behind the bookshelf. The certified deed copy, normally kept in the front sleeve, had been moved behind old tax records. In its place lay a notarized, durable power of attorney. The document did not legally declare Trevor my guardian. It purported to appoint him as my agent over banking and property, with expanded authority if physicians later certified that I lacked capacity. Attached was a false statement, claiming cognitive decline. The signature looked like mine, but I had never signed it. Trevor was not merely suggesting assisted living. He was building a paper trail he could use to impersonate my authority, pressure banks, and support a guardianship petition. I photographed every page without removing the document. I also photographed the safe, the file arrangement, and the deed copy that remained inside. My memory had not failed me. Someone had entered my study, moved my records, and planted a forged instrument designed to make my decisions appear invalid. A cold anger settled in my chest, but I did not touch the company's payroll account, vendor funds, or money belonging to customers. I opened the secure portal for Lawson Family Holdings. The reserve displayed $382,560. Every deposit could be traced to my trust, and the capital support agreement allowed me to revoke Trevor's drawing authority if I reasonably suspected fraud, misuse, or an attempt to exploit me. The forged power of attorney and the missing deed gave me more than suspicion. I called the bank's fraud line, completed identity verification, revoked Trevor's authority on the reserve and household support accounts, and instructed the bank to preserve the login history and pending transactions. The bank did not send the money to an anonymous offshore shell. It moved the reserve into a domestic attorney-controlled escrow account held in my trust's name. The transfer was documented and traceable. The operating company still retained payroll, fuel insurance, and legitimate freight funds. What vanished was Trevor's ability to use my reserve for his mansion luxury leases, gambling, or private expansion scheme. The screen refreshed. Available balance for Trevor's reserve access, $0.00. His business had not been destroyed. His private safety net had been removed. Tomorrow, the luxury and personal payments he had scheduled against my money would fail. If he wanted to keep living like a millionaire, he would have to explain where the money was actually going. When you spend 40 years mapping out complex supply chains and tracking freight across the American continent, you learn exactly how people are found, and more importantly, how to remain unfound. I knew the moment the banks opened tomorrow, Trevor would go nuclear. He would come to my house furious, demanding answers. And with that forged power of attorney in his possession, he could easily call the police, claim his senile father was missing, or having a manic episode, and force me into a psychiatric ward against my will. I could not be anywhere near this zip code when the sun came up. I moved with methodical, unfeeling precision. I took a worn canvas duffel bag from the hall closet. I packed exactly 3 changes of practical clothes, my blood pressure medication, and every original identification document I possessed. I intentionally left behind my credit cards, my smartwatch, and the expensive tablet Trevor had gifted me for Christmas, knowing fully well he tracked the location services on all of them. I walked out to my garage and looked at my reliable sedan. I popped the hood and reached behind the dashboard, expertly detaching the GPS tracking module my son had insisted on installing a year ago, supposedly for my safety. I crushed the device under my heavy boot. I pulled the SIM card out of my mobile phone, snapped it in half, and tossed it into the recycling bin. I grabbed an old prepaid burner phone I kept in my toolbox for emergencies, loaded my bag into the trunk, and pulled out of the driveway at exactly 3 in the morning. The suburban streets were completely empty. The darkness was a comforting blanket protecting my escape. I drove 40 miles out of town to a rundown motel sitting on the edge of the county line, the kind of place that accepted cash after recording the identification required at check-in. I paid for 2 weeks up front using the emergency cash I always kept hidden in my floorboards. I walked into the stale, dimly lit room, locked the heavy deadbolt, and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. I turned on the burner phone and dialed into my bank automated alert system, entering Trevor account number. I put the phone on speaker and laid it on the nightstand. It was 4:30 in the morning. Somewhere across town, Trevor was sleeping peacefully in his silk sheets, entirely oblivious to the fact that his financial lungs had just been collapsed. The countdown had begun. The sun pushed through the motel blinds while I drank bad coffee from a paper cup. At 8:15, the burner phone connected to the secure alert portal I had arranged before leaving home. The first notices came from the household support account and the reserve Trevor no longer controlled. A $7 purchase at his premium coffee shop was declined. Monica's $400 florist charge failed. A luxury vehicle payment was rejected because Trevor had scheduled it against the family support account after already missing 2 earlier payments from his own funds. The warehouse payroll did not fail. Before leaving, I had instructed the bank and the company controller to protect ordinary payroll fuel insurance and active shipping obligations. Employees and drivers would not be punished for Trevor's misconduct. What failed were the personal expenses and unexplained transfers he had hidden inside accounts funded by me. I did not use a secret backdoor application to enter Trevor's email server. The bank sent alerts to me because I owned the reserve account. The company controller, who still reported to the independent directors, forwarded only the operational notices I was legally entitled to receive as guarantor and beneficial owner of the support capital. Vendors were asking why extraordinary payments had stopped. A private auto finance company sent Trevor a final repossession warning. The SUV was already seriously delinquent. The latest rejected payment merely ended the lender's last extension. Then the forwarded voicemail arrived. Dad. Where are you? The bank says my access is gone. Call me immediately. 10 minutes later, another message followed. This time, his voice was ragged. The repo company took Monica's SUV outside the country club. The bank says the owner of the reserve revoked my authority. Fix this now, or I will prove you are not competent to manage anything. I leaned back and listened. He did not ask whether my stroke symptoms had worsened. He did not ask whether I had medication or a safe place to sleep. His first concern was the coffee, the car, and the money. Trevor believed the forged power of attorney would allow him to reverse the restrictions and force me back under his control. He was wrong. A private document naming him as agent could not erase the bank's fraud review, and a forged document gave him no legitimate authority at all. Still, he could use it to support a false missing person report or an emergency guardianship petition. That made him dangerous. I dialed the number of the lawyer I had not called in 10 years. The financial separation was complete. The legal defense had to begin before Trevor persuaded the authorities that the man protecting his own assets was a confused patient who needed to be confined. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel mattress, watching the dust motes dance in the harsh light filtering through the cheap plastic blinds. I had successfully severed the financial lifeline my son had grown fat on, but the brief sense of victory was entirely overshadowed by a cold reality. I knew Trevor. He was desperate, cornered, and utterly ruthless when his luxurious lifestyle was threatened. He would not simply sit back in his sprawling mansion and watch his empire crumble into dust. He would use the system against me. I turned on the motel television while keeping the volume low. The local news had just begun its morning traffic report when a missing vulnerable adult bulletin appeared across the screen. My photograph filled the display. The anchor said, Gerald Lawson, 70, had been reported missing by his son after leaving home during recovery from a recent stroke. Trevor had supplied a copy of the forged power of attorney and claimed I had been diagnosed with dementia, was confused, and had left without medication. The police had not declared me legally incompetent. They had opened a welfare investigation based on a family report and asked the public to contact them if I was seen. The bulletin was serious, but it was not a criminal warrant, and it did not make me a fugitive. Trevor's purpose was still obvious. The report created a paper trail portraying my transfer of the reserve funds as the act of an impaired man. If he could persuade a court to appoint him temporary guardian, he could challenge my banking decisions and the control of my home. I looked toward the motel office. The clerk who had checked my identification the night before was standing outside with a phone at his ear. He glanced from the television in the lobby toward my room and pointed. A patrol car turned into the gravel lot. I did not assume the officers intended to arrest me. They were responding to a vulnerable adult report. But if I opened the door without counsel, Trevor's false medical story could place me in an evaluation room before I had the documents to defend myself. I packed the burner phone medication identification and cash into my duffel bag. The rear maintenance exit opened into an alley behind the motel. I slipped outside as the officers approached the front walkway. A deputy knocked and identified himself. He said they had received a report that I might be medically endangered and asked me to answer if I could hear him. I continued down the alley. The officers did not immediately smash the door because a relative had demanded it. The motel clerk provided a key after the deputies explained the emergency report. When they entered and found the room empty, they called in the description of my sedan. I moved behind the abandoned diner and into the tree line bordering the property. My heart pounded, but I reminded myself that I had committed no crime. I was avoiding an improperly framed welfare encounter until a lawyer could establish my competence and expose the forged paperwork. The woods were wet and uneven. My recovering right side tired quickly, and the weakness in my hand returned when I gripped the duffel strap. The escape was not the effortless performance of an action hero. I stopped twice to control my breathing and check that I still had my blood pressure medication. Behind me, radio traffic and footsteps moved around the motel. The officers found the disabled sedan and confirmed that I had been there. That discovery would expand the search, but it would also preserve the fact that I had taken medication identification and clothing conduct inconsistent with a helpless man wandering without awareness. I reached an old service road used by delivery trucks. 40 years in logistics had taught me how secondary roads connected warehouses, truck stops, and county lines, but I could not remain hidden in the woods. I needed legal protection, medical proof of competence, and a safe address the police could verify through counsel. At an operating truck stop several miles away, I used the public customer service telephone to call a former fleet supervisor named Daniel. I told him I was the subject of a false family report and needed transportation to my attorney's home. I did not ask him to conceal me in a sleeper berth or evade a checkpoint. Daniel arrived in a company pickup with a passenger seat and asked to see my identification. During the drive, I called the non-emergency number from the truck stop phone and left a message stating that I was alive, had my medication, and would communicate through counsel. I did not disclose my location because I feared financial exploitation by the reporting family member. The message changed the situation. Police still wanted to confirm my safety, but they now knew the missing person was communicating coherently and invoking legal representation. 2 hours later, Daniel dropped me at the home of Stanley Pierce. I was no longer trying to disappear forever. I was moving the dispute into a place where evidence, not Trevor's television performance, would determine whether I controlled my own life. Before leaving the truck stop, I asked Daniel to stop at a pharmacy. The pharmacist verified my identity, contacted my physician, and issued a short emergency refill because some medication remained inside the impounded sedan. I kept the receipt and discharge information. Those ordinary records later became useful evidence that I was managing my care rather than wandering in confusion. Daniel also photographed me, holding the day's newspaper, and sent the image to Stanley through an encrypted legal intake address. The photograph was not released publicly. It gave counsel a time-stamped record of my condition before Trevor could claim I had been drugged or transported against my will. During the drive, Daniel kept the radio tuned to the local bulletin. The description still called me medically vulnerable, but the station had not labeled me dangerous or accused me of a crime. That distinction prevented the trip from becoming an absurd chase through police barricades. I wrote a short statement in Daniel's cab describing the restaurant confrontation, the forged document, and the reason I feared returning home. I signed and dated it while he witnessed my handwriting. The statement was not a substitute for testimony, but it preserved my account before Trevor could claim Stanley had invented it later. At the pharmacy, I also asked the pharmacist to note that I answered the medication questions without assistance. By the time we reached Stanley's neighborhood, several independent people had seen me oriented planning and managing my health. Trevor had tried to make age itself proof of incapacity. I was beginning to build the opposite record, one ordinary decision at a time. I asked Daniel not to tell anyone, except Stanley, where he had taken me. He agreed, but I did not ask him to lie if police contacted him. He would state that I appeared competent, requested counsel, and traveled voluntarily. That instruction protected him from becoming part of an evasion scheme and protected me from another false claim of kidnapping. When the pickup turned into Stanley's street, I called the investigating sergeant once more. I left Stanley's name, bar number, and office telephone. I authorized the sergeant to confirm my safety through counsel that afternoon. I had not disappeared from the law. I had removed Trevor as the person permitted to define my condition. The door opened to reveal Stanley Pierce. Stanley was a retired corporate attorney, a man who possessed the legal ferocity of a starved wolf and the cunning of a seasoned chess grandmaster. We had spent 30 years destroying rival freight companies in the boardroom, exploiting legal loopholes, and building a massive empire. He looked at my mud-stained boots, the canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and the cold determination in my eyes. He did not ask questions. He simply stepped aside and motioned for me to enter his private study. The room smelled of expensive cigars and aged leather. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, handed one to me, and sat behind his massive mahogany desk. I took a slow sip, allowing the burning liquid to steady my nerves, and I told him absolutely everything. I told him about the physical therapy bills, the forged power of attorney, the empty bank accounts, and the silver alert broadcasting my face across the state. Stanley did not look surprised. He took a sip of his scotch, leaned back in his leather chair, and fixed his sharp gray eyes on me. "I warned you about that boy a decade ago, Gerald," he said, his voice completely devoid of pity. His words pulled me back to a dark, suffocating memory I had tried so desperately to bury. 10 years ago, before Trevor officially took over the logistics company, Stanley had uncovered a massive discrepancy in our accounting department. Trevor had been quietly embezzling funds, systematically siphoning over $200,000 to fuel a reckless gambling habit and impress Monica, who was merely his girlfriend at the time. Stanley had prepared the paperwork to hand Trevor over to the authorities, warning me that a thief in the family would eventually burn the entire house down. But I was a grieving widower at the time, desperate to hold on to the only family I had left. I begged Stanley to make the legal problem disappear. I paid the stolen money back from my personal retirement fund, covered up the missing assets, and saved my son from a decade in federal prison. Trevor wept at my feet, swearing on his mother and her memory that he would reform, that he would build the company to honor our family name. I made a solemn vow to Stanley that day. I promised that if Trevor ever betrayed my trust again, I would not offer him a life vest, I would hand him an anchor. Stanley was now looking at me, waiting to see if I was finally ready to honor that decade-old promise. I placed my empty glass on his desk. I told him the life vest was gone and I needed him to help me forge the anchor. Stanley opened his laptop, but he did not enter private bank accounts or federal systems simply because he had once practiced corporate law. We began with records I was entitled to provide. I gave him the Lawson Family Holdings Agreement, the reserve account statements, tax records, corporate formation documents, and the account alerts showing Trevor's attempted use of my money. As founder and guarantor, I also possessed archived shareholder reports and asset schedules from the years before I stepped away. Stanley contacted a licensed forensic accountant who had previously worked for the company's outside audit firm. Before reviewing current internal data, she obtained written authorization from the independent director named in the corporate charter to act if the company's finances or an elderly guarantor were threatened. The review did not happen in 3 magical hours. Through the afternoon and into the evening, they compared public lion filings, UCC records, warehouse mortgages, vehicle registrations, annual reports, and the ledgers preserved from the reserve account. The first discovery was devastating. Apex Logistics still existed as a legal company and continued moving freight, but many assets, Trevor described as company property, were no longer owned outright. Several warehouses had been sold to financing entities and leased back. Most of the truck fleet was subject to expensive sale and leaseback agreements. Equipment values had been pledged more than once, and some inventory listed in lender reports could not be matched to purchase records. The company was not imaginary, but the balance sheet, Trevor showed investors, was a hollow performance. It depended on constant short-term borrowing and on capital he drew from my reserve. Stanley identified vendor payments to consulting companies sharing addresses, officers, or telephone numbers with entities connected to Trevor. Those records justified a formal audit, but they did not yet prove where every dollar had gone. He also found a cluster of transfers disguised as equipment deposits. The recipients did not match legitimate manufacturers or known freight suppliers. Some money returned through cash-intensive businesses. Other transfers ended at payment processors associated with wagering. Stanley stopped before making a final accusation. "We have evidence of serious misrepresentation and probable diversion," he said. "We do not yet have lawful access to every destination account, and we are not going to invent certainty." That distinction mattered. Chapter 7 of The Disaster was still hidden inside those unexplained transfers. We knew Trevor had stripped value from the company and concealed the damage. We did not yet know the exact debt driving him to steal my house. The forensic accountant prepared preservation requests for the banks and the company's email administrator. Stanley drafted an emergency board notice. Any deeper access would come through corporate authorization subpoenas or Trevor's company-owned devices, not through illegal intrusion. Near midnight, the first response arrived from the bank handling the suspicious vendor wires. The pattern pointed toward gambling-related processors and a private creditor whose name Stanley recognized. He turned the screen toward me. "This is where the real reason begins," he said. The next morning, the forensic accountant received the company's emergency audit authorization and began reviewing the records preserved by the outside directors. The source material was limited and documented company, bank statements, vendor files, corporate card reports, payroll records, the email archive from Trevor's company account, and a forensic image of the company-owned phone assigned to him under a policy permitting review during a fraud investigation. Stanley did not intercept private messages in real time or break into unrelated personal accounts. The financial pattern emerged slowly. Trevor had used legitimate freight revenue and repeated short-term loans to maintain the appearance of a thriving company. When cash became tight, he sold equipment and leased it back at punishing rates. The trucks still moved and the warehouses still operated, but the company owned far less than investors believed. That explained how a functioning logistics network could later be restructured or liquidated, even though many original assets had already been sold. The deeper loss came from gambling. Payments described as route optimization fees and equipment reservations flowed through intermediaries to online betting processors, offshore casinos, and cash service businesses. The investigators could not yet identify every final recipient, but the amounts and timing matched messages preserved on Trevor's company phone. Monica's spending appeared in the corporate card reports and in the household support account I owned. Designer purchases, country club dues, private travel spa memberships, and luxury leases consumed tens of thousands of dollars each month. I did not need her private banking statements to see how the lifestyle was being funded. Trevor had charged many of those expenses directly to the company or to accounts backed by my reserve. The most serious evidence came from a series of messages between Trevor and a contact saved only as M. The messages referred to a principal balance of $400,000 weekly interest and a payment deadline 7 days away. The language was threatening, but Stanley refused to label the sender a criminal syndicate based on a nickname alone. He forwarded the device image and the account information to the Financial Crimes Unit through the company's outside counsel. A detective familiar with illegal lending operations later confirmed that the number and payment instructions had appeared in other investigations involving violent collection tactics. That was the first supported basis for calling the creditor dangerous. Trevor had not created the forged power of attorney to expand a healthy business. He needed the equity in my home because the company's legitimate collateral was exhausted. The reserve access had been revoked, and a private creditor expected $400,000 before the week ended. My house was paid off and worth close to $500,000. With a forged authority document and the missing deed, Trevor believed he could obtain an equity loan, pay the creditor, and preserve his public image. The discovery explained the urgency without making Gerald or Stanley omniscient. We did not know whether the threats would be carried out. We did know Trevor believed them had hidden them from Monica and had begun using my identity and medical condition as tools to obtain money. I remembered the first time Stanley had confronted me about Trevor's theft 10 years earlier. Trevor had diverted more than $200,000 while gambling and trying to impress Monica. I repaid the company, persuaded the board not to refer the matter, and convinced myself that shame would reform him. Stanley had warned me that removing every consequence would teach Trevor that consequences did not exist. Now the company records showed that I had not saved him. I had financed the next larger offense. The account deadline also changed our immediate risk. Trevor could no longer wait months for a guardianship case. He needed documents or property he could present to a lender quickly. Stanley advised me to preserve evidence contact, the police handling the false missing person report, and avoid returning home. He arranged for a physician to evaluate my cognitive condition that afternoon. The examination documented that I was oriented, understood my assets, managed my medication, and showed no signs of dementia. The report would not end every dispute, but it weakened the false story Trevor had built. Stanley then contacted the title company and county recorder. He filed a fraud alert against any mortgage or power of attorney presented in my name. He did not secretly sell the house within minutes. He prepared a transfer into the Gerald Lawson Residence Trust, a domestic trust with a named independent trustee and a recorded address. The transfer would be signed by me, notarized, and recorded openly. Before we could finish the paperwork, my burner phone sounded. The alert came from the security system at my home, months earlier after cash and silverware began disappearing. I had installed visible cameras at the entrances and in the shared rooms. A notice beside each entrance stated that audio and video recording could occur. The bedrooms and bathrooms were not monitored. The front door camera showed Trevor and Monica on the porch. Trevor wore a dark hooded sweatshirt and carried a steel crowbar. Monica kept looking toward the street. The alarm system announced through the exterior speaker that the property was under audio and video surveillance. Trevor looked directly at the camera. Then he drove the crowbar into the doorframe. Stanley reached for the telephone to call police while I opened the live feed. Trevor was no longer waiting for a legal shortcut. He was breaking into the house to find the documents himself. The company's audit committee simultaneously restricted Trevor's access to extraordinary transfers and instructed the controller to protect payroll, fuel, and customer freight already in motion. The goal was not to create a collapse that would injure drivers and warehouse employees. It was to stop additional diversion while the board established which obligations were legitimate. A preliminary review of the household foreclosure notice also showed that Trevor had changed the online credentials on the marital mortgage account and hidden 3 months of delinquency from Monica. That fact did not make her innocent of every later act, but it explained why the notice had frightened her and why she had believed the company still possessed more money than it did. By the time the security alert arrived, the evidence formed one continuous chain: concealed asset sales, gambling losses, luxury spending, a private debt, a forged power of attorney, a false medical report, and an imminent attempt to reach the equity in my home. The audit team also found that Trevor had sent investors monthly reports, claiming the company still owned the same fleet and warehouse network described in documents from years earlier. Those statements were now preserved for the board and regulators. Stanley warned me not to assume that every inaccurate report was criminal. Some values could reflect accounting errors or outdated schedules. The case would depend on whether Trevor knowingly used false information to obtain money. That careful distinction kept our investigation grounded. We were assembling evidence, not writing a revenge story, in which every suspicion became an established fact. The security feed filled the burner phone screen as Trevor forced the damaged front door inward. The alarm repeated that audio and video recording was in progress. He heard the warning, looked toward the visible camera, and entered anyway. Stanley called the police and gave them the property address, the false missing person report number, and the fact that the recorded homeowner was safely present with counsel. He also asked the alarm company to preserve the original files with timestamps and digital verification. The first camera showed Trevor and Monica moving through the living room. Trevor carried the crowbar. Monica used a flashlight and urged him to hurry because the creditor's deadline was approaching. They did not know where I was, and we did not speak through the system. We watched while police were dispatched. Monica opened drawers in the kitchen and searched for the cash envelope my late wife once kept beneath the counter. She swept old recipe cards onto the floor and broke several ceramic plates. In the bedroom, she pulled clothing from the closet and searched jewelry boxes. The cameras did not record private changing areas. They captured only the entrances and shared hallways. The study camera showed Trevor heading directly toward the oak bookshelf. I had discovered the original paper deed, missing before I fled, but the county's recorded title did not disappear merely because a physical document had been taken. A certified duplicate remained in an older property file. Earlier that day, after my competence evaluation, I had signed the deed transferring the home to the Gerald Lawson Residence Trust. Stanley's office had submitted it electronically to the county recorder, and the title company had marked the property for enhanced verification. The transfer was not anonymous, and it was not a fake cash sale. The trust was domestic, identified an independent trustee, and preserved my lifetime right to occupy the house. Its purpose was to prevent Trevor from using a forged power of attorney to mortgage or transfer the property while the dispute was investigated. The recorder had accepted the filing before Trevor reached the house. Trevor pushed the books from the lower shelf and exposed the safe. He knew the combination because I had once trusted him with emergency access. He entered it incorrectly on the first attempt, then opened the door on the second. Inside, he found the forged power of attorney he had planted and the outdated certified copy of the deed. I had not left an original title instrument as bait. The county record, not the paper in his hand, controlled ownership. Trevor held the documents beneath the camera and laughed. "We have it," he told Monica. "The deed and the authority. The bank can lend against the house." Monica entered the study carrying several silver serving pieces. She dropped them onto the carpet and asked whether the document would survive scrutiny. Trevor said the bank would see a notarized power of attorney, a deed bearing my name, and a son claiming to act for a father with dementia. He believed the lender would move quickly because of his former business status. The recording captured him saying that the loan proceeds would cover the $400,000 debt. It also captured his plan to place me in a facility after the transaction, so I could not challenge it. Those statements were important, but Stanley cautioned me not to call them a complete confession before investigators authenticated the file and determined whether the audio was admissible. The alarm notice, visible cameras, and digital chain of custody strengthened the evidence. They did not eliminate the need for legal review. Monica searched another cabinet while Trevor photographed the papers with his company phone. The device upload would later create its own metadata trail. The two of them took the outdated deed copy, the forged power of attorney, several silver items, and a small jewelry case. Trevor closed the safe and led Monica through the broken front door. Police arrived after they had driven away. The officers did not catch them inside, but they documented the splintered door-damaged room's missing property and camera system. The alarm company transferred a verified copy of the recording directly to the evidence portal. I spoke with the responding sergeant by video from Stanley's office. I showed identification, explained the false vulnerable adult report, and gave permission for officers to secure the house. Stanley provided the cognitive evaluation and the recorded trust filing. The sergeant canceled the urgent missing person search after confirming I was safe and communicating voluntarily through counsel. The separate investigation into the false report remained open. The officers photographed the safe, the damaged lock, and the empty spaces where property had been taken. They also found fragments from the door and a partial shoe impression in the hallway. None of that evidence required us to manufacture a federal trap. Trevor and Monica had created an ordinary burglary and attempted property fraud case with their own actions. Stanley contacted the commercial bank, whose name appeared in Trevor's recent lending inquiries. The bank's fraud counsel agreed to flag any application involving my address, deed, or signature. The bank would not approve a $500,000 equity loan merely because a branch manager owed Stanley a favor. If Trevor presented the papers, the lender would verify the county title contact, the recorded trustee preserve the application, and notify investigators. That was the lawful trap. Trevor believed the outdated deed and forged authority made him the owner of my future. In reality, the papers showed only what he intended to do. The recorded trust protected the property, and the security evidence documented how he obtained the documents. Stanley turned away from the screen after the police finished securing the house. "He will go to a bank as soon as it opens," he said. I looked at the time. The creditor's deadline was still approaching, and Trevor believed he had found his last source of equity. We did not need to lure him or falsify a transaction. We only needed the bank to perform the verification it was legally required to perform. Before the officers left, they installed a temporary board over the damaged door and changed the alarm code at my request. I did not return to the property that night. An officer collected my remaining medication from the bedroom and delivered it to Stanley's office through a documented release. The investigation also corrected another weakness in Trevor's story. His missing person report said I had left without essential treatment, yet the motel room, my video call, and the medication inventory showed that I had planned my departure carefully. The sergeant added that information to the report. Monica's conduct was evaluated separately. The recording showed her entering after the alarm warning, searching the house, removing property, and discussing the loan. She could not later claim she had merely accompanied a worried husband checking on his father. Trevor's use of the company phone mattered as well, because the device belonged to the business and was already subject to a preservation order. Investigators could seek the photographs and location records through normal legal process. Stanley did not remotely enter the phone or alter its contents. By midnight, 3 independent sources preserved the same sequence. The alarm provider held the original video, police held the scene photographs and property list, and the county held the newly recorded trust deed. That separation protected the case from any claim that Stanley and I had created the evidence after the fact. The house had been violated, but the title, my competence, and the record of the intrusion were now stronger than they had been before Trevor arrived. The responding officers also advised me not to contact Trevor directly or announce that the documents were useless. Allowing him to discover the title problem through the lender's ordinary verification process would reduce the risk of confrontation and preserve his unprompted statements. Stanley obtained a temporary no-contact order based on the forced entry and documented threat to use my identity. The order did not determine guilt or automatically evict anyone from unrelated property. It required Trevor and Monica to stay away from my residence and communicate through counsel until a hearing. A repair company secured the broken entrance the following morning. The trustee paid the invoice from the resident's account, creating another independent record of the damage. The commercial bank opened at 9 the next morning. Stanley and I did not sit behind tinted glass spying on us, a private customer meeting. The bank's fraud counsel had asked us to remain available in a separate conference room because I was the person whose identity, signature, and property were expected to be used. The branch staff knew only that an enhanced verification alert had been placed on the address. They were instructed to follow normal procedure, preserve any suspicious application, and contact the recorded trustee before discussing loan approval. Trevor and Monica entered shortly after the doors opened. A senior loan officer later described the meeting in her written statement, and the bank's ordinary lobby cameras preserved their arrival. Trevor presented the forged power of attorney, the outdated certified deed copy, and a proposed equity loan application for $500,000. He claimed I suffered from dementia and had authorized him to manage my property for medical expenses. The loan officer entered the address into the county database. The current record identified the Gerald Lawson Residence Trust as owner. It also displayed the property fraud alert and the contact information for the independent trustee. The loan officer stopped the interview and brought the documents to the branch manager and fraud counsel. They compared the power of attorney with the notice Stanley had filed, confirmed that I disputed the signature, and contacted the county recorder. No one told Trevor that the house had been sold anonymously for cash 3 days earlier. The manager explained that title had been transferred the previous day into a recorded domestic trust, and that Trevor had no verified authority to borrow against it. The bank could not approve the loan. The manager also informed Trevor that the application and documents would be retained for review because the recorded owner had reported suspected forgery and elder financial exploitation. Trevor was free to obtain counsel and provide legitimate proof of authority, but the bank would not return the submitted originals until its legal department determined its preservation obligations. Trevor demanded that the manager rerun the title search. He insisted I was mentally incompetent and that any transfer I signed should be ignored. The manager did not decide my competence. He said the bank would rely on the public title record, the trustee's instructions, and any later court order. A son's allegation did not permit a lender to disregard ownership records. Monica asked whether another bank might accept the documents. The manager warned her that presenting a disputed power of attorney and deed elsewhere could create additional evidence of attempted fraud. He gave them the contact information for the bank's legal department and ended the meeting. Only after Trevor and Monica left did the fraud counsel come upstairs to speak with us. She placed copies of the application and documents on the table. The bank had timestamped the session, recorded the device information used to prepare the online portion, and preserved the lobby footage. She asked me to confirm in a sworn statement that the signature was not mine and that I had never authorized Trevor to seek the loan. I signed after reading every page. Stanley provided the cognitive evaluation, the prior fraud notice, the trust certificate, and the police report from the break-in. The bank agreed to send the package to the investigators, already reviewing the forged power of attorney. This was not entrapment. We had not encouraged Trevor to commit a crime he was not already planning. We had warned the lender and allowed its verification system to expose the false documents he voluntarily presented. From the bank's security recording later obtained through legal process, we saw Trevor's reaction. His confidence disappeared when the manager explained that the house no longer stood in my individual name. He looked down at the power of attorney and began connecting the empty reserve, the trust filing, and the missing person report. He understood that I was not wandering in confusion. He also understood that the bank had preserved the documents. Trevor left without the loan and without the original packet he had submitted. Monica followed him into the street, crying and demanding another plan. The creditor's deadline had not changed. The company audit had restricted his remaining financial access. His proposed collateral had failed. The public story that I lacked competence was now contradicted by a physician's report, a recorded trust deed, and my sworn bank statement. Stanley advised me not to celebrate. A desperate person could still lie to the media, file an emergency petition, or accuse the trust itself of wrongdoing. That prediction proved correct. By evening, Trevor stood outside the police precinct before a row of cameras. He had transformed the failed bank application into a new performance, a public claim that unknown financial predators had kidnapped his father and stolen his property. The bank scene had not completed the legal case. It had simply removed Trevor's last quiet way to obtain the money. His next move would be louder. Before leaving, the fraud counsel clarified that the bank had not frozen Trevor's unrelated personal accounts or made a criminal finding. Its role was narrower: reject a loan unsupported by valid title-preserved documents presented under suspicious circumstances and cooperate with lawful requests. That distinction protected me as much as it protected the bank. I did not want a dramatic scene that could later be described as a private vendetta coordinated through Stanley's friendships. I wanted a record created by employees following ordinary underwriting and fraud procedures. The branch manager also documented Trevor's effort to pressure staff by invoking his position at the logistics company. He claimed he could move significant corporate deposits away from the bank if they delayed him. The threat was ineffective because the company's audit committee had already suspended his transaction authority. Monica repeatedly asked whether the trust could be reversed that same day. The manager explained that only the trustee, a court, or a legally authorized transaction could change the title. A forged paper in a briefcase could not do it. Those details showed that Trevor had received clear notice before he later accused unnamed strangers of stealing the house. The bank sent me a written confirmation that no credit inquiry or lien would remain against the resident's trust because the application had been rejected before closing. That detail protected the property from the paperwork damage Trevor had tried to create. The independent trustee also issued notice that any future request involving the house required direct confirmation from both the trustee and me while I remained competent. The measure was protective, not permanent guardianship over my own choices. I sat in the heavy leather chair in the corner of the study, nursing a glass of scotch while the evening shadows stretched across the room. We had completely shattered Trevor at the bank that morning. I expected him to panic, to flee the city, or perhaps to finally break down and confess everything to the police in exchange for protection from the loan sharks hunting him. I had severely underestimated the depths of my son's manipulative brilliance when backed into a deadly corner. Stanley entered the study with the television remote and turned on the evening news. Trevor stood outside the police precinct wearing a rumpled sweater. Monica clung to his arm while he told reporters that financial predators had manipulated a vulnerable stroke survivor, moved his savings into a trust, and taken control of his home. He said he had filed a police report, requested an adult protective services review, and asked a probate lawyer to seek emergency protection of my assets. He could not order the district attorney to freeze the trust through a press conference. Nor did a federal task force appear because viewers were angry. What his performance accomplished was pressure. The sheriff's department reopened contact with Stanley to verify my location and condition. APS opened a preliminary file because Trevor alleged exploitation of an older adult. The title insurer requested additional documentation before processing any further transaction involving the house. The bank preserved its application file. Those were ordinary responses to conflicting claims, but the headlines made them look like proof that Trevor's story was true. Stanley muted the television. Trevor had transformed himself from the man who presented forged papers into the grieving son of an allegedly kidnapped father. If I remained silent, every institution would hear only his version, while the trust bank transfer and disappearance appeared connected. The public outrage did not give him ownership of the money. It did give him a narrative he could use in a guardianship petition and in negotiations with frightened creditors. Our anonymity was no longer useful. The recorded trust identified a trustee and legal address, so investigators could find the paperwork without invading an imaginary network of shadow organizations. Stanley prepared to provide the competence report, bank statement, burglary footage, and my voluntary message to police. I watched Trevor's face frozen on the screen and remembered Evelyn warning me years earlier that every rescue taught him to create a larger disaster. This time I would not solve the disaster with another payment. I told Stanley we would contact the investigating agencies openly and invite Trevor to a controlled legal meeting where his claims could be tested against the evidence. The next phase would not depend on hiding. It would depend on documented facts, independent witnesses, and a lawful opportunity for Trevor to choose whether he continued lying after being confronted. The news station later received a written correction from Stanley, stating that I was alive and represented. It declined to reveal my location, but updated the report to say that the allegations were disputed. That small correction did not end the controversy. It prevented Trevor from continuing to present the missing person claim as an uncontested fact. I stared at the television, feeling a sickening wave of guilt wash over the burning anger in my chest. Looking at Trevor shedding those crocodile tears, I was violently pulled back to a memory I had spent decades trying to suppress. It was 20 years ago. My late wife Evelyn was standing in our kitchen leaning against the counter. She was watching me write a massive check to cover the damages Trevor had caused after crashing a stolen sports car into a storefront. It was his third arrest that year, and once again I was burying his crimes under a mountain of cash. Evelyn had reached out, grabbing my wrist with her frail, trembling hands. Her eyes were filled with a profound, terrifying sorrow. She begged me to stop paying his way out of the consequences. She warned me that my relentless need to protect him from the harsh realities of the world was not building a man. She told me I was building a monster, a predator, who would eventually consume us both because he had never learned the concept of accountability. I had foolishly brushed her off, insisting that a father duty was to provide a safety net for his family. I told her he just needed a little more time to mature. Now looking at the monster manipulating millions of viewers on live television, the crushing reality of my failure shattered my heart all over again. Evelyn was absolutely right. My endless financial tolerance had taught him that the rules did not apply to him, that he could lie, cheat, and steal his way to the top as long as he cried the right tears. I had unknowingly funded his transformation into a man willing to sacrifice his own father to save his own skin. The blame was not entirely his. I had handed him the hammer and the nails he was using to build my coffin. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the wooden bar cart in the corner of the study. I picked up my half-empty glass of scotch and poured the amber liquid straight down the brass sink drain. I turned back to face Stanley. My old friend was watching me closely, waiting to see if the immense pressure of a federal investigation and public outrage would cause me to fold. I told Stanley that we could no longer hide behind anonymous trusts and shadows. Trevor wanted to drag this war into the blazing light of the public arena. He wanted to use the law and the media as a weapon to force my hand. I decided right then and there that I was going to give him exactly what he was begging for. I was going to step out of the darkness and walk right into his trap. I instructed Stanley to draft a highly specific legal notice. We were going to invite my son to a formal mediation, dangling the one thing he needed to survive right in front of his face. We were going to make him believe his media circus had worked, that the pressure had broken me, and that I was ready to surrender the assets to make the pain stop. It was time to end the defensive maneuvers. The ghost was going to return from the dead, and I was going to set a snare so tight my son would snap his own neck trying to escape it. The game of hide and seek was officially over. Stanley began drafting the meeting notice that night. It was not a false legal summons, and it did not promise that I would sign away my house. A lawyer cannot manufacture a settlement offer with no intention of honoring it merely to trick someone into incriminating himself. The letter was a genuine invitation to confidential mediation. It stated that I was alive, represented by counsel, and willing to discuss 3 subjects: Trevor's public allegations, the disputed power of attorney, and the preservation of any legitimate interest he claimed in the former family business. It also stated that no property transfer would occur unless both sides exchanged verified documents and signed a lawful agreement. Stanley deliberately included one sentence. Trevor would focus on, I was prepared to discuss a financial resolution after he explained the bank application and withdrew any false statements about my competence. That was not a promise of money. It was enough to attract a man who believed he could dominate me in person. The notice required Trevor to attend with counsel if he wanted legal advice. It warned that the meeting could be documented and that no participant had authority to use force, seize property, or arrange an involuntary medical hold. A licensed courier delivered the letter to Trevor's office. Within 2 hours, his lawyer's assistant confirmed that Trevor accepted the meeting, but would attend without separate counsel, because he considered the matter a family dispute. Stanley sent a second notice recommending that he reconsider. Trevor declined again. His refusal would later matter. We had not denied him counsel. That evening, Stanley received an email from the mediation center stating that Trevor had asked to add 2 APS representatives and a contracted geriatric clinician to the attendee list. Trevor claimed their presence was necessary because I might need immediate support. The request was not secret. The center's rules required all parties to receive the final attendee list. APS had agreed only to observe and conduct a voluntary welfare assessment if I consented. The representatives possessed no authority to strap me to a gurney or commit me because Trevor wanted it. An emergency psychiatric hold would require a qualified professional to find an immediate danger to myself or others under state law. Trevor had nonetheless described the meeting to them as an opportunity to intercept a confused man being controlled by financial predators. He hoped their observations would support an emergency guardianship petition. Stanley asked whether I wanted to cancel. I said no. We responded in writing that I would permit the APS representatives and clinician to attend. I would answer questions about my orientation, medication, and financial decisions, but I would not consent to transport or treatment absent a lawful emergency. Stanley also notified Detective Miller, the financial crimes investigator assigned to the bank and corporate records. Miller did not become part of a private revenge plan. He reviewed the burglary report, forged document bank application, and false missing person allegations. After consulting a prosecutor, he agreed to attend as an observer and to preserve any voluntarily produced evidence. No arrest had been promised. The prosecutor was preparing warrant applications based on independent evidence, but a judge had not yet ruled. Miller's presence ensured that no participant could falsely claim the meeting had been an attempted kidnapping by either side. We prepared the evidence in separate folders. One contained the physician's competence evaluation and medication record. One contained the reserve agreement and documented escrow transfer. One contained the title record and trust certificate. The final folder contained the bank application, police photographs, and verified security camera files. The video would not be played as entertainment. Stanley arranged for the alarm provider's custodian to certify the recording and remain available by video to explain the timestamps, visible recording notice, and preservation process. On the morning of the mediation, I dressed in a charcoal suit and reviewed every document. I was not walking into a psychiatric ambush. I was entering a room with witnesses who had been told 2 incompatible stories. Trevor believed he could cry point at my age and make the state accept his version before the evidence appeared. I intended to let him speak first. Stanley also served a litigation hold notice on Trevor and Monica, requiring them to preserve their phone's loan communications, medical claims, and copies of the power of attorney. The notice did not force compliance by itself, but destroying records after receipt could support sanctions or obstruction allegations. The mediation center assigned a neutral retired judge to manage the session. He was told that no document would be signed until each participant had time to review it, and that either side could end the meeting. I recorded a short video statement before leaving Stanley's house. In it, I stated the date, named the people I expected to meet, described my medication, and explained that I was attending voluntarily. The file was sent to my physician and the investigating sergeant. That precaution mattered, because Trevor's strategy depended on claiming every calm decision I made was controlled by unseen captors. By documenting my choices before the meeting, I created an independent record that I understood the risks and purposes. Stanley checked the trust account one final time. The funds were not offshore, hidden, or beyond lawful review. They remained in domestic escrow and could be traced from the reserve account to the trustee. The room would contain no white flag and no executioners. It would contain a neutral mediator, social service professionals, a clinician counsel, an investigator, and a son who had chosen to arrive without a lawyer despite repeated advice. The mediation center occupied the upper floor of a downtown law building. Stanley walked beside me carrying the evidence files. Detective Miller arrived separately and waited near the conference room with the neutral mediator. When the doors opened, Trevor and Monica sat at the far end of the table. Two APS representatives and a geriatric clinician occupied seats along the side. They carried clipboards and identification badges, not medical restraints. The clinician had no ambulance hidden in the adjoining room. A transport team could be called only if a genuine emergency developed and the legal criteria for involuntary evaluation were met. Trevor had still arranged the room as though I were expected to arrive confused. A glass of water and a stack of transfer documents waited in front of the chair, marked with my name. I entered in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying my medication list and identification in a thin folder. The APS representatives stood. Their expressions showed immediate uncertainty because my appearance did not match Trevor's description of a wandering man unable to care for himself. That alone did not prove competence. A person can dress well and still be impaired. The clinician introduced herself and asked whether I understood where I was, why the meeting had been called, and who accompanied me. I answered each question directly. I gave the date, described my stroke, named my medication, explained the reserve account transfer, and stated that Stanley represented me. Trevor pushed away from the table and hurried forward with his arms open. "Dad, thank God. We have been terrified." I raised one hand. "Sit down." The neutral mediator stepped between us and reminded everyone that physical contact required consent. Trevor returned to his chair, but he immediately began performing for the APS representatives. He said Stanley had isolated me, manipulated my fears, and moved my assets into a trust I could not understand. He described my departure as a psychiatric crisis and claimed the bank transfer proved I was dangerous to myself. The clinician asked Trevor for the medical diagnosis supporting those claims. He offered the forged power of attorney and said it had been notarized. A power of attorney was not a diagnosis, and a notary acknowledgement did not prove the signature or the factual statements within the document. The clinician asked whether any physician had diagnosed dementia. Trevor admitted no physician had examined me recently. He said my behavior was obvious evidence. I handed the clinician my independent cognitive evaluation discharge records therapy plan and medication list. She reviewed them without announcing a conclusion. Monica began crying. She claimed Stanley and the unnamed trust were financial predators who had taken advantage of my stroke. Trevor urged APS to remove me before I signed anything else. One representative explained that APS did not order involuntary hospitalization based on a relative's request. Their role was to assess risk-offer services and refer evidence to appropriate agencies. If the clinician believed I posed an imminent danger, she could recommend emergency intervention, but nothing she had observed supported that conclusion. Detective Miller then identified himself. He did not threaten to handcuff Trevor for speaking or claim that a false report automatically created an immediate felony arrest. He said he was investigating the break-in, the disputed power of attorney, the bank application, and the corporate transfers. No one in the room was required to answer his questions without counsel. He reminded Trevor that Stanley had twice recommended legal representation. Trevor said he needed no lawyer because he had done nothing wrong. Miller stated that the meeting would continue as mediation, not interrogation. If Trevor chose to make statements, they could be preserved according to law. The neutral mediator asked each side to describe the desired outcome. Trevor said he wanted the trust reversed, control of the house restored to Gerald's estate, and the reserve money returned so he could protect his father's care and stabilize the company. I said, I wanted three things: formal recognition that I remained competent, preservation of the forged documents and bank records, and an end to Trevor's authority over my finances and medical information. Stanley opened the first folder. He presented the Lawson family holdings agreement, showing that my trust owned the reserve and that Trevor's drawing authority could be revoked for suspected misuse. He presented the domestic escrow statement showing where the money had gone. The funds had not vanished into an untraceable offshore entity. He then presented the recorded residence trust deed, the title company verification, and my physician's competence report. Trevor interrupted, saying every document had been manufactured after my disappearance. The mediator asked Stanley to show the filing dates, notary information, and independent confirmations. The timeline matched the bank, county physician, and alarm provider records. Stanley did not yet play the burglary video. He gave Trevor an opportunity to explain why the disputed power of attorney bore a signature I denied making, and why he had presented it to a bank after receiving notice that the title was disputed. Trevor said I had signed the document months earlier and later forgotten. The clinician asked him where the signing occurred and who witnessed it. Trevor named a notary, but could not identify the location. Stanley produced a state record search showing that the named notary's commission had expired before the date on the document. Monica looked at Trevor. The first visible fracture appeared between them. Trevor changed his story. He claimed a staff member had arranged the paperwork and that he had trusted the document without reviewing it. Detective Miller wrote the statement down but did not argue. The mediator turned to me and asked whether I was willing to transfer any property as part of settlement. No, I said. I was willing to discuss verified claims. He has offered none. Trevor stood and pointed at me, insisting my refusal proved paranoia and mental decline. The APS representative told him that disagreeing with an adult child and protecting assets were not clinical symptoms. She asked him to sit so the meeting could remain safe. He obeyed, but his voice rose. He said the company would collapse, employees would lose jobs, and violent creditors would come after the family if I did not release the money. That admission moved the discussion away from my alleged medical welfare and toward his own financial emergency. Stanley placed the bank application on the table. It listed the requested loan amount as $500,000 and described the purpose as business expansion and elder care expenses. The corporate audit showed no approved warehouse expansion. The mediator asked Trevor which explanation was true. Trevor stopped speaking. Stanley opened the final folder. We are not here to force a property transfer, he said. We are here to determine whether your public allegations survive the evidence. He asked the APS representatives and clinician whether they were willing to view a certified security recording from the house. They agreed. The alarm provider's custodian, joined by video, confirmed the camera locations, described the entrance notice announcing audio and video recording, and verified the file hashes and timestamps. Only then did Stanley reach for the presentation remote. Trevor looked toward the door. Detective Miller did not block it. The mediator reminded Trevor he was free to leave unless police had lawful grounds to detain him. Trevor remained because he still believed he could talk his way through the recording. The lights dimmed. The conference room screen came to life. Before the recording began, the clinician completed a short, structured screen at my request. She asked me to recall 3 words. Explain the practical effect of transferring a house into trust, describe what would happen if I stopped taking my blood pressure medication, and compare the consequences of settlement with litigation. I answered without assistance. The exercise was not a complete neuropsychological examination, but it created an observation independent of my own physician. Trevor watched the clinician write that I understood the nature and consequences of the decisions under discussion. The mediator then asked Monica whether she had personally seen me sign the power of attorney. She said Trevor handled the documents. When asked whether she entered my home during the night, she claimed they had gone only to retrieve emergency medical information. Stanley noted the statement without arguing. The video would allow the professionals to compare her explanation with her conduct. Miller reminded everyone that inconsistencies were not by themselves proof of a crime. The purpose of preserving them was to let investigators and courts evaluate intent with the complete record. That measured approach made Trevor visibly impatient. He had expected emotional accusations he could dismiss as the bitterness of an old man. Instead, each institution in the room was performing a separate role and documenting its own observations. Trevor realized the dynamic in the room had shifted, but he refused to surrender. He turned his body away from Detective Miller and focused his entire performance on the two state medical evaluators sitting at the edge of the table. His eyes welled up with manufactured tears. He pointed a trembling finger at Stanley and the detective, claiming that these were the exact financial predators he had warned the state agency about. He choked on his words, begging the evaluators to see how these men were manipulating his severely ill father. He claimed I was in the middle of a paranoid delusion and that my aggressive behavior was a cry for medical intervention. He pleaded with them to deploy the medical restraints and transport me to a safe psychiatric facility before I could cause any more harm to myself or my family. It was a staggering display of pathological lying. Monica joined in burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly, playing the role of the terrified, exhausted daughter-in-law. I did not interrupt them. I let them dig the hole as deep as possible. The two evaluators looked uncertain. The younger one glanced at Detective Miller, trying to weigh the authority of a police badge against the desperate cries of a supposedly loving family. I slowly turned my attention to the lead evaluator. I told him that I completely understood his hesitation. I explained that my son had spent his entire life perfecting the art of playing the victim to escape accountability. I told the state workers that they did not need to take my word for it. They just needed to look at the wall. Stanley activated the projector. The first image showed the front entrance of my house. A timestamp and alarm system identifier appeared at the bottom of the frame. Before Trevor touched the door, the exterior speaker announced that audio and video recording was in progress. The recording showed him look directly toward the camera and drive the crowbar into the frame. The APS representatives watched Trevor and Monica enter after the alarm warning. The video followed them through the monitored shared areas. It did not include bedrooms or bathrooms. In the kitchen, Monica opened drawers, broke dishes, and searched for cash. In the hall, she carried silver pieces toward the study. Trevor shifted in his chair and said the footage showed a worried son entering his father's house during an emergency. Stanley advanced to the police photographs of the splintered door and the alarm log recording the forced entry signal. The responding officer's evidence report listed the missing silver jewelry case and property documents. The study camera showed Trevor opening the safe with a combination he already knew. We did not falsely describe that act as cracking a safe. The offense came from entering without permission and removing property, not from defeating the lock. Trevor lifted the forged power of attorney and outdated deed copy toward the light. His own voice came through the speakers. He told Monica they could use the papers to obtain a $500,000 equity loan. He said the money would pay the private creditor and allow them to restart the company. The next statement was even more damaging. Trevor said that after the transaction, he would place me in a facility so I could not reverse it. Monica asked whether I might challenge the document. Trevor answered that the dementia report and medical hold would make my objections appear unreliable. The recording ended before police arrived. Stanley did not call the video an automatic conviction. He placed beside it the alarm custodian's certification, the police scene report, the bank application, and the county title record. Each source supported a different part of the sequence. Detective Miller stated that investigators would still need to authenticate the evidence formally and determine which state and federal offenses applied. The video established conduct and statements. It did not allow anyone in the room to pronounce a sentence. Trevor claimed the recording had been edited. The alarm custodian explained that the original files had been uploaded automatically to the provider's server and transferred directly to the police evidence portal. The digital hashes matched. Stanley and I had received viewing copies but could not alter the original. The APS clinician turned to Trevor and asked why he had told the agency I was in immediate danger when the recording showed him planning to use a medical hold after taking the property. Trevor offered no coherent answer. The lead APS representative documented that I appeared oriented, understood the financial dispute, possessed independent medical evidence, and had taken steps consistent with self-protection. She also documented allegations of elder exploitation, coercive control, false reporting, and attempted misuse of health services. APS did not become a prosecution team. The representatives said they would close the emergency removal request, offer me protective services, and refer their observations to law enforcement and the probate court if a guardianship petition was filed. The professionals Trevor had invited to validate his story now had a documented basis to reject it. The meeting had not proven every crime. It had destroyed the claim that I needed to be restrained for my own safety. The neutral mediator recorded that no property would be transferred and that the session would continue only if all participants remained calm. The clinician also noted that fear, anger, and distrust after a break-in did not automatically indicate paranoia. Those reactions had to be evaluated against the events that actually occurred. The mediator asked Trevor whether he wanted a recess to contact counsel before the financial records were discussed. He refused, saying the video had been misunderstood and the money would prove that Gerald was the real offender. That decision moved the meeting into the next chapter without repeating the confrontation already shown. Monica broke the silence first. She stood, struck both hands against the table, and accused me of stealing Trevor's company money. She said the empty accounts had caused the failed vehicle payments, the corporate crisis, and the threat from the private creditor. I let her finish. Then Stanley placed the reserve agreement, operating account statements, and escrow records in the center of the table. The documents did not say that I owned every dollar belonging to Apex Logistics or that a joint signer could freely take corporate property. The lawful position was narrower and fully documented. Lawson Family Holdings, my revocable trust, owned the $382,000 capital reserve. Trevor possessed conditional drawing authority under the support agreement. The account had funded approved expansion costs and some household expenses, but it was not the company's payroll account, and it was not Trevor's personal property. When I discovered the forged power of attorney and suspected misuse, I revoked that authority under the agreement. The bank moved the remaining reserve into domestic attorney-controlled escrow. Every dollar remained traceable and available for review. The company's legitimate operating accounts had continued paying drivers, fuel suppliers, insurers, and active freight obligations. If Trevor's personal coffee, Monica's flowers, and overdue luxury vehicle failed, it was because they had been charged against support accounts they no longer had permission to use. Monica looked toward Trevor. He had allowed her to believe the entire company had been emptied. In reality, the financial crisis existed before my withdrawal. The asset sales, gambling losses, and concealed debt had hollowed out the business. Stanley presented the emergency audit resolution. Independent directors, not Gerald acting alone, had restricted Trevor's extraordinary transaction authority and preserved the company records. The audit showed equipment sale and leasebacks, duplicate collateral claims, suspicious consulting vendors, and gambling-related payments. The evidence did not make me innocent of every possible civil dispute. Trevor could challenge the reserve transfer or trust in court. What he could not do was truthfully describe a documented revocation of access to my reserve as theft of a healthy company. I turned to Trevor. The forged power of attorney was different. The bank application was different. The false medical report, break-in removal of property, and effort to obtain a loan against a house he did not own were not exercises of a contractual right. Detective Miller stepped closer to the table. He did not announce that every allegation carried a mandatory minimum federal sentence. The applicable charges depended on jurisdiction, intent loss, and the evidence accepted by a court. Miller explained that investigators were reviewing attempted bank fraud, identity-related offenses, forgery, burglary, elder financial exploitation, false reporting, and the diversion of company funds. Some conduct could support federal charges because it involved banks' interstate transfers and electronic communications. Other conduct belonged to state prosecutors. A prosecutor had already submitted warrant applications based on evidence gathered before the mediation, the verified break-in recording, the forged document, the bank application, and the company records. The judge had not been asked to rely on anything Trevor might be forced to say in the room. Trevor asked whether he was under arrest. Miller answered that the judge's decision had not yet been delivered to him. Until then, Trevor was free to remain silent, consult counsel, or leave, unless another lawful basis for detention arose. The answer frightened him more than a theatrical threat would have. It meant the case existed independently of my anger. Trevor looked toward the door. Then his company phone vibrated against the table. The message preview came from the contact associated with the private creditor. It demanded payment by midnight and threatened violence against both Trevor and Monica. Miller instructed Trevor not to delete the message. He said the threat itself could be reported and investigated. Law enforcement could discuss protective measures, but no officer could guarantee safety in exchange for a confession. Monica moved away from Trevor. The threat exposed another lie. Trevor had told her the house would fund a business expansion. The message showed that the money was intended to satisfy a private debt. Trevor's breathing became shallow. He asked me for $400,000. He said the reserve was mine, the trust was mine, and the amount meant nothing compared with my total assets. He promised to enter gambling treatment and surrender every interest he claimed in the company. I reminded him that he had already used my medical condition, home, and identity to avoid the consequences of his earlier choices. I would not transfer money to an unidentified creditor or finance a payment connected to threats. Doing so could expose us to additional danger and conceal the creditor's crimes. Detective Miller told Trevor there was a lawful path report. The threats identify the lenders surrender any weapons or evidence and request protective consideration through the prosecutor. That path did not erase the financial offenses. It separated the immediate safety problem from the criminal case. Trevor lowered himself to the floor beside my chair and gripped my trouser leg. He invoked fishing trips, his mother, and the fact that he was my only son. He asked me to become the safety net one final time. I removed his hands and told him to sit back. His mother had warned me years earlier that paying every debt would teach him to create greater debts. I had ignored her. The forged papers and broken door were the result. I will not give you money, I said, but I will not hand you to violent men either. Trevor looked up. The investigator can protect you through lawful custody and cooperation, I continued. You can speak to a lawyer, surrender on any warrant the judge approves, and tell the authorities what you know about the creditor. That is the only way out I will support. The financial guillotine was not a father deciding his son deserved prison. It was the disappearance of the money and influence Trevor had always used to avoid a legal choice. Stanley also clarified that the reserve transfer had not cured the company's broader insolvency. The operating business still faced creditor claims, lease obligations, and possible restructuring. Returning the reserve to Trevor would not restore the warehouses or erase the gambling losses. It would only give him another pool of money to divert. The independent directors had appointed a restructuring officer to determine whether viable routes could continue and whether employees could be protected through a sale. Gerald's refusal to release private support capital was separate from the board's duty to manage the company. The prosecutor's office had also advised Miller that threats from illegal lenders must be investigated without arranging a private payoff. Cash delivered under pressure could disappear without ending the danger and could expose the family to repeated extortion. Trevor was therefore not being asked to choose between certain death and a confession. He was being offered access to Police Protection Council and a formal process while the existing warrant application moved forward. The suffocating tension in the room was suddenly pierced by a sharp, harsh vibration. It was coming from the inner pocket of Trevor's jacket. The sound was muffled, but in that dead silence, it sounded like a fire alarm. Trevor flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck. His shaking hand reached into his jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. I watched his eyes dart across the illuminated screen. Whatever color was left in his face vanished completely. He looked as though all the blood had been instantly drained from his veins. The device slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the polished mahogany table screen facing upward. From where I sat, I could clearly read the brief encrypted text message that had just sealed his fate. The sender was an unsaved number. The message was brutally simple. Time is up at midnight. We are not asking anymore. We are coming to collect. If you do not have the 400,000, your wife will watch us take it out of your hide piece by piece. The abstract threat of a federal prison sentence was suddenly entirely eclipsed by the very real, very immediate promise of brutal physical violence. Federal prosecutors move slowly over months and years. Men who lend hundreds of thousands of dollars in the shadows do not operate on court schedules. They operate on blood and fear. Trevor stared at the phone, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of an animal realizing its leg is caught in a steel trap while the hunter approaches. His legs simply gave out beneath him. Trevor slipped off the edge of his expensive leather chair and crashed heavily onto the floor. He did not try to stand back up. He scrambled across the thick carpet on his hands and knees, dragging himself toward where I was sitting. It was a pathetic, wretched display that completely erased the arrogant, entitled businessman he had spent his entire adult life pretending to be. He reached out and wrapped his arms tightly around my legs, burying his tear-soaked face against the fabric of my tailored trousers. "Dad, please, you have to save me," he sobbed, his voice muffled and broken. "They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to find me tonight, and they are going to kill me. I need the money. I just need the 400,000. You have it. I know you have it in those offshore trusts. Please, I am your son. I am your only son. Do not let them do this to me." I was weeping uncontrollably, clutching at my legs with desperate strength. He begged me to remember the times we went fishing when he was a little boy. He invoked the memory of his mother, pleading that she would never let this happen to him. He promised he would check himself into a rehabilitation clinic for his gambling addiction. He swore he would sign away all his rights to the company, to my house, and to any future inheritance. He offered to become my servant, my driver, anything I wanted, if I would just make a single wire transfer to save his life. I looked over at Monica. She was pressed hard against the far wall of the conference room, trying to put as much physical distance between herself and her husband as the space would allow. The text message had specifically mentioned her watching him get torn apart. The sheer terror in her eyes was completely unfeigned. She looked down at the man groveling on the floor, weeping for his life, and the absolute disgust on her face was unmistakable. The illusion of their powerful, glamorous marriage had entirely evaporated. She did not see a partner or a provider anymore. She saw a massive walking target. She saw a man who had lied to her about his wealth and dragged her into a deadly crossfire with violent criminals. She wrapped her arms around herself, shrinking into the corner, her survival instincts rapidly calculating a way to flee the city before the sun went down. She was not going to stand by a sinking ship. She was actively looking for a lifeboat, even if it meant stepping on his head to reach it. I sat rigidly in my chair, looking down at the top of my sun head. For 45 years, my immediate biological response to his tears had been to reach out, lift him up, and shield him from whatever pain he was facing. The instinct to protect your child is deeply ingrained in a father's soul. But that instinct had been permanently severed the moment I watched him use a crowbar on my front door and heard him laugh about locking me in a psychiatric ward. The man crying at my feet was not my son. He was a hostile parasite that had finally run out of hosts to feed on. I placed my hands firmly on his shoulders, not to comfort him, but to push him away. I applied enough pressure to force him to release his grip on my legs. I commanded him to let go of me and sit up straight. Trevor slowly lifted his head, his face slick with tears and sweat. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, searching my face for any sign of mercy, any glimmer of the soft, forgiving father he had exploited for decades. He found absolutely nothing. My expression was a solid, impenetrable wall of stone. I told him that evoking the memory of his mother was the most shameful thing he could possibly do in this room. I reminded him that his mother had begged me to stop bailing him out of trouble 20 years ago. She had known exactly what he would become if he never faced the consequences of his actions. I informed him that I was finally honoring her dying wish. I kept my voice deadly quiet, ensuring every single syllable carried the weight of absolute finality. I told him that I did not care if the men hunting him broke his hands or burned his luxury cars to the ground. I stated that his massive gambling debts were a nightmare he had built with his own 2 hands, and I was not going to spend a single dime of my hard-earned wealth to buy him another day of undeserved freedom. Trevor let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping his face back into his hands. His entire body shook with the violent tremors of a man who knew his execution had just been confirmed. The state medical evaluators watched the scene in stunned silence, completely horrified by the chaotic breakdown of the man who had tried to hire them. Detective Miller stood stoically observing the spectacle with the cold detachment of a law enforcement officer who had seen countless criminals hit absolute rock bottom. I let Trevor sob on the floor for a few long, agonizing moments. I let the crushing reality of his situation fully settle into his bones. I let him feel the absolute darkness of having 0 options left. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, bringing my face closer to his. I told him to stop crying and listen to me very carefully. I told him that I was not going to give him a single penny to pay off the violent syndicate hunting him down. I was not going to wire any money to save his fraudulent business or his collapsing lifestyle. But I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes, and I offered him the final devastating piece of my strategy. I told him that while I would not give him a single penny, I would give him a way out. Trevor remained on the carpet, staring at Detective Miller. When I said there was a lawful way out, hope flickered across his face. He still expected a check. Stanley removed that illusion by placing a 1-page notice in front of him. It was not a pre-written confession. The document confirmed only that Trevor had been advised of 3 facts: he could consult a lawyer, he could voluntarily surrender if an arrest warrant had been issued, and he could request to speak with prosecutors about the threats and the identity of the private creditor. A 2nd page was a consent form allowing investigators to preserve the threatening message and the company phone. Signing it would not admit every allegation or waive his right to remain silent. Stanley explained the choices carefully. Trevor could leave the mediation unless Miller received a valid warrant or developed another lawful basis to detain him. If he left, he remained responsible for his safety and for complying with any future court order. He could also ask for counsel immediately. The mediation center would provide a private room and a telephone. No statement about the bank house company or creditor would be taken until he decided whether to speak. The 3rd choice was voluntary surrender and cooperation. If a warrant had been approved, he could enter custody through the secured garage rather than walk into the street, while a threatening creditor searched for him. His attorney could then discuss protective housing and any cooperation agreement with the prosecutor. No one promised a favorable sentence dismissal or special prison placement. Those decisions belonged to prosecutors, the defense, and the court. Trevor looked at the phone on the table. The threat remained visible on the screen. He asked Miller whether the police could arrest the lender instead. Miller said investigators needed names, numbers, payment instructions, and truthful information. He also said Trevor's own offenses would not disappear because another person threatened him. Trevor asked what would happen if he refused everything. "You retain your rights," Miller said, "but you do not receive $400,000 from your father, and we cannot protect you from a threat you refuse to report. The neutral mediator offered another break so Trevor could seek legal advice. For the first time that morning, Trevor accepted. I used the private room to call a criminal defense attorney from the referral list Stanley had provided with the mediation notice. Monica remained at the table staring at the floor. She did not ask whether I was safe or whether the break-in had damaged memories of Evelyn. Her attention stayed fixed on the threatening message and the possibility that the creditor might target her. After 20 minutes, Trevor returned with the attorney participating by secure video. The lawyer stated that Trevor would not make a full confession during mediation. He would consent to preservation of the phone, voluntarily surrender if the warrant existed, and consider a proffer only after reviewing discovery and receiving written terms from prosecutors. That was a legally meaningful choice rather than a signature extracted by fear. Miller's phone rang while the attorney was speaking. He stepped into the hallway, then returned with a copy of the judge's signed warrant. The warrant relied on the break-in recording forged power of attorney attempted bank loan and company records. It did not rely on Trevor's statements during the mediation. Miller placed the warrant on the table and allowed the attorney to read it on camera. Trevor's shoulders collapsed. His lawyer advised him not to resist and to preserve the threatening communications. Trevor signed the limited device consent form and the voluntary surrender acknowledgement. He did not sign a document declaring himself guilty of every offense. Monica watched him write his name. The practical meaning was still devastating. Trevor had chosen custody because the criminal case was real and because cooperation offered the safest path away from the private creditor. When he put down the pen, Monica removed her wedding ring. She did not claim moral superiority. The burglary footage had already shown her participation, and investigators would examine her conduct separately. Her decision came from self-preservation. She placed the ring on the table and said she would retain her own lawyer. Miller told her she was not free to destroy evidence or ignore future process. He also explained that if she feared the creditor, she could make a report and request victim safety assistance. No one guaranteed entry into witness protection. Monica left the conference room after providing her contact information and accepting a preservation notice. Trevor watched the door close behind her. The marriage company and family performance had disintegrated without a coerced confession or a father threatening to let criminals kill his son. Stanley collected the unsigned settlement documents. The choice was complete. Trevor would be taken into custody under a judge's warrant. Any statement about his crimes or the private creditor would occur with counsel and under formal procedures. The APS representatives documented that the meeting ended without a medical emergency and that Gerald had remained oriented throughout. The clinician returned the unused assessment forms to her file. There had never been restraints or a transport order to execute. The neutral mediator signed a closing memorandum listing the participants, the documents exchanged, the time the warrant was presented, and the fact that Trevor had consulted counsel before surrendering. That record protected every side from later claims that the signature or custody decision had been manufactured in secret. Trevor's attorney also requested that the prosecutor be notified immediately of the surrender so the defense could seek a prompt detention hearing. The attorney reserved the right to argue for release medical treatment and protective conditions. Miller agreed. Custody was not presented as an automatic sentence or a favor controlled by Gerald. A magistrate would decide whether Trevor remained detained. The creditor threat would be included in that hearing both as a safety concern and as evidence relevant to flight risk. Trevor's cooperation could be discussed later, but nothing said in the mediation guaranteed a benefit. For the first time, Trevor faced rules that did not bend simply because he invoked family. Detective Miller waited until Trevor's attorney confirmed that the surrender could proceed. He instructed Trevor to stand and place his hands behind his back. Trevor complied. The handcuffs closed once, and Miller advised him of his rights in a calm, practiced voice. The arrest did not occur because Trevor had signed a coerced confession. It occurred under the warrant a judge had approved from evidence gathered before the mediation. Trevor asked to withdraw the device consent, His attorney explained that investigators could preserve the company-owned phone under the warrant regardless, but that any custodial interview would stop if Trevor invoked his right to counsel. Trevor did so. Miller acknowledged the invocation and asked no questions about the bank, the power of attorney, or the creditor. Even with counsel protecting his rights, Trevor's panic returned. He turned toward me and begged me to tell the police that the dispute had been resolved. He promised to repay the reserve, surrender any company interest, and enter treatment. I did not tell Miller to release him because I had no authority to cancel a judicial warrant. I also did not promise prosecutors that I would refuse to cooperate. The criminal case no longer belonged to a private father-son negotiation. Trevor called me dad, repeatedly searching for the man who had paid every prior loss. I stood still. For decades, I had confused intervention with love. Each time Trevor broke a rule, stole money, or created a debt, I removed the consequence before it could teach him anything. That habit had damaged him and everyone around him. Now the lawful consequence had arrived. Miller and a uniformed officer escorted Trevor toward the hallway. They did not drag him for spectacle or tighten the restraints as punishment. His attorney remained connected by video and received the processing location. At the door, Trevor looked back and accused me of abandoning him. "I stopped abandoning you today," I said. "I stopped paying for the next disaster." The doors closed behind him. His voice faded along the corridor, leaving the conference room quiet. The APS representatives gathered their files. The clinician confirmed that no emergency hold was warranted, and that any future guardianship claim should include the competence report and evidence of the financial conflict. The arrest was not a concrete bunker, selected by Gerald as a form of personal protection. Custody could reduce Trevor's immediate exposure to the threatening creditor, but jail was still a legal consequence governed by a court. Protective decisions would be made by authorities after assessing the threat. I watched the elevator indicator descend and felt no triumph. Evelyn had understood the problem before I did. Years earlier, when Trevor stole money and damaged property, she had asked me to let him face the ordinary consequences. I refused because his pain felt like evidence of my failure as a father. The money I used to rescue him became insulation. It kept reality from reaching him, while his conduct grew more reckless. That did not make me responsible for the forged document, the burglary, or the bank application. Trevor made those choices. But I was responsible for deciding whether I would continue financing the pattern. Refusing the $400,000 was not a wish that he be harmed. I had directed him toward police protection counsel and lawful surrender instead of a secret payment to violent creditors. For the first time, help did not mean removing accountability. Stanley closed the evidence files and said the prosecutor would contact us about the next steps. The company's independent directors would continue the audit, and the residence trustee would supervise repairs to the house. No account or property was beyond review merely because it sat in a trust. I looked at the empty chair where Trevor had sat. The son I remembered, and the defendant who had just left were not separate people. Pretending otherwise had allowed me to excuse too much. I was still my child, but love did not require me to lie for him, fund him, or surrender my freedom to him. The most honest act I could offer was cooperation with a fair process. If the evidence failed, the court could reject it. If Trevor possessed a defense, his lawyer could present it. If he chose to identify the people threatening him, investigators could act on that information. I would not decide his sentence, and I would not purchase his escape. The conference room no longer felt like an execution chamber. It felt like a place where the family's private mythology had finally been replaced by records, witnesses, and law. That replacement was painful, but it was real. After Trevor left, Miller returned the limited device consent form to Stanley and noted that the phone would be collected under the warrant. He asked us not to contact the threatening number or attempt our own negotiation. The neutral mediator sealed the original attendance record. The APS representatives prepared separate notes rather than signing a statement written by Gerald's legal team. That separation mattered. The final case would include people who had reached their conclusions through their own duties, not witnesses reading from a script designed by a wealthy father. I also authorized the prosecutor to share the threat information with Trevor's defense attorney. Protecting him from unlawful violence did not require protecting him from the charges created by his own conduct. The distinction was the boundary I had failed to maintain for most of his life. The massive conference room fell into a deep, heavy silence that pressed against my ears. The two medical evaluators from the state agency silently gathered their clinical clipboards and their unused medical restraints from the floor. They looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep professional respect. They gave me a brief silent nod before walking out the door, thoroughly shaken by the dark, twisted family drama they had just unwittingly participated in. Stanley remained seated at the mahogany table, quietly organizing the massive stacks of banking records and property deeds back into the compartments of his leather briefcase. He clicked the heavy brass locks shut and looked up at me, his gray eyes steady and calm. He did not offer me empty platitudes or generic words of comfort about time healing all wounds. He simply told me that the cancer had been completely excised from my life and that the patient was going to survive. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the sprawling city far below. The violent storm had finally passed, but it had taken my entire familiar landscape with it. I had spent 45 years defining my entire existence as a provider, a dedicated father, a protector of my bloodline. Now the bank accounts were entirely secure, the properties were locked safely in anonymous trusts, and the predators who shared my last name were permanently neutralized. I had successfully defended my life, my legacy, and my freedom. Yet as I looked at the bustling streets beneath me, I realized I was standing on a completely blank canvas. The toxic ties that had bound me to a life of silent suffering were severed, but the sudden absolute absence of family left a hollow, ringing space in my chest. I had to learn how to breathe again, without the suffocating weight of a parasitic sun dragging me under the water. I had to figure out how to navigate the quiet twilight of my life, completely alone, carrying the heavy knowledge that my own flesh and blood had gleefully tried to bury me alive for a handful of cash. The legal and financial war was definitively won, but the quiet, solitary journey to rebuild my soul from the ashes was only just beginning. 4 months after the mediation, I lived in a secure apartment, while Stanley and the independent directors untangled the company records. Trevor was not automatically confined in a maximum security prison without bail. After his initial appearance, a judge ordered pretrial detention based on the alleged fraud, the attempt to obtain my property, the unresolved threat from the private creditor, and the risk that he might obstruct the investigation. He remained in a federal detention center while his lawyer prepared the defense. The prosecutors were still authenticating records and determining the roles of other people. No trial had occurred, and no final sentence existed. A prepaid phone I kept for case-related messages rang one morning. Monica called from a public telephone. Her voice was frantic. She said the people connected to Trevor's $400,000 debt had continued contacting her after his arrest. Men had followed her, entered her apartment, and demanded money. I did not assume every claim was true, but the earlier messages made the danger credible. Monica asked me to transfer the full balance. She argued that I had enough money in the domestic trust, and that paying would end the threat. I told her I would not send money to unidentified people outside the legal system. A secret payment could finance further crime, conceal evidence, and encourage another demand. That did not mean I told her simply to keep running. I gave her the direct number for Detective Miller's unit, the prosecutor's victim services coordinator, and a local emergency shelter. I told her to call 911 if anyone was outside the building, preserve every message, avoid meeting the creditors, and ask her attorney about a protective order and relocation assistance. Federal witness protection was not something I could promise. Eligibility would depend on her cooperation, the seriousness of the case, and decisions made by authorities. Monica insisted she was innocent. I reminded her that the security recording showed her entering the house after the alarm warning, searching rooms, removing property, and discussing the loan. She had also participated in the false narrative about my competence. Her role might differ from Trevor's, but she was not merely an uninformed passenger. I said I would provide the threatening messages to investigators if she sent them through counsel. I would not provide cash housing or private protection in exchange for silence. She called me family. I told her family did not erase the need for boundaries or accountability. Then I ended the call. I did not destroy the phone or SIM before preserving the call information. I wrote down the time and number, saved the voicemail header, and sent the device to Stanley so investigators could determine whether it related to the creditor. After counsel confirmed the relevant data had been preserved, the prepaid line was closed. That was the final personal conversation I had with Monica. Cutting contact did not require me to ignore a credible threat to her life. It required me to direct the threat into lawful channels without becoming the family's secret bank again. The same week, Miller informed Stanley that Monica had retained separate counsel and requested an interview. Investigators would decide whether she qualified as a cooperating witness, a suspect, or both. Gerald did not negotiate that status. The apartment was secure, but I no longer treated secrecy as my only protection. My physician, lawyer, trustee, and the lead investigator all knew where I lived. The false missing person report had been corrected in writing. My medical records identified me as competent, and the court handling the trust dispute had my current contact information under seal. That network mattered more than disappearing. Trevor had exploited isolation. He counted on being the only person speaking for me. By allowing independent professionals to verify my decisions, I reduced his ability to resurrect the dementia story. I also began weekly counseling for survivors of elder financial abuse. The sessions did not excuse Trevor or make the betrayal less serious. They helped me distinguish legal preparation from permanent fear. When the prepaid phone stopped ringing, the silence in the apartment no longer felt like hiding. It felt like control returning to its rightful owner. The judge later allowed Monica limited access to undisputed personal funds for housing and medical needs, while the traced company money remained restrained. That order demonstrated that the court could protect basic safety without returning the luxury lifestyle or releasing evidence. Monica's attorney provided the threatening messages to investigators. Whether she ultimately cooperated or faced charges would depend on the evidence, not on my willingness to forgive her. I stopped following the daily details after Stanley confirmed that lawful protection had been offered. Remaining informed was necessary. Remaining emotionally entangled was not. With the personal contact ended, I turned to the remains of Apex Logistics. The company could not auction warehouses and trucks it no longer owned. The restructuring officer first identified what remained: customer contracts, dispatch, software, office equipment, leasehold interests, several unencumbered vehicles, and claims against the shell vendors Trevor had used. Some profitable routes were sold to responsible carriers that agreed to retain drivers. Other operations were closed after employees received wages, benefits, and required notice. The sale and leaseback obligations were negotiated with the asset owners rather than treated as company property. The process was supervised by the independent directors, creditors, and restructuring counsel. I did not personally strip the company for revenge. The business name was eventually retired because its financial statements could no longer support a credible recovery. Watching the final sale was painful, but it ended the illusion. Trevor had maintained and preserved what value remained for employees, legitimate creditors, and restitution claims. The residence trustee handled the sale of my suburban house. A young couple purchased it after receiving a clean title report and disclosure of the repaired door damage. The trust paid the closing costs and transferred the net proceeds into my documented retirement account. I retained enough money for independent living, medical care, taxes, and reasonable travel. Half of the remaining net proceeds went not to an anonymous charitable trust, but to a registered nonprofit foundation with an independent board, annual reporting, conflict of interest rules, and audited accounts. Its mission was to provide emergency legal representation for older adults facing forged powers of attorney, coercive guardianship petitions, property theft, and financial abuse by relatives. Stanley served as outside counsel, not sole controller of the money. Grants and case decisions were approved by the independent directors. The Foundation's first programs funded competence evaluations, title fraud alerts, emergency protective orders, and access to lawyers for seniors who could not afford them. I could not undo the choices that brought my family to court. I could ensure that another person facing the same tactics would not have to escape through a motel alley before anyone believed him. The liquidation ended one company. The Foundation converted its remaining value into a lawful defense for people whose age had been mistaken for weakness. Every transfer was recorded, reviewed by tax counsel, and disclosed as required. The protection I wanted to create would not depend on hidden accounts or personal favors. The board published a final report explaining which assets had been sold previously, which remained leased, and how the closing proceeds were distributed. Employees received a truthful account instead of another polished story about a successful empire. Late that afternoon, the day before the new owners were scheduled to take possession, I drove my rental car back to the suburban neighborhood for one last visit. The street was quiet, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. I unlocked the front door and walked through the completely empty rooms. The echo of my footsteps sounded hollow against the bare hardwood floors. I walked past the kitchen where my wife used to cook Sunday dinners. I walked past the repaired doorframe where my son had used a steel crowbar. I stood in my old study looking at the blank wall where the heavy steel safe used to be hidden. There were no tears left to cry. The overwhelming grief that had threatened to crush me months ago had been entirely replaced by a profound, deep-seated tranquility. I had survived a violent emotional assassination attempt. I had outsmarted a predator who shared my bloodline. I had protected my dignity, my freedom, and my mind. I walked out the front door and pulled it shut, listening to the heavy deadbolt click into place for the final time. I slipped the brass key under the welcome mat for the new family. I walked down the long concrete driveway, pulling a single, sleek leather suitcase behind me. A black luxury town car was idling quietly at the curb, its exhaust mixing with the crisp autumn air. The driver stepped out respectfully, opening the rear door for me. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and instructed him to head directly to the international airport. I leaned my head back against the headrest, watching the house disappear from view as the car accelerated down the street. I was leaving the country, entirely leaving the wreckage and the ghosts far behind me. I was heading toward a completely clean slate, stepping onto a path where my future belonged to absolutely no one but myself. The morning sun in Tuscany carries a different weight than the harsh light of the American suburbs. It pours over the rolling hills, bathing the ancient stone walls of my rented villa in a rich golden warmth that feels like a quiet blessing. 18 months had passed since the mediation, and 1 year since the federal court entered Trevor's sentence. I sat on the rustic terrace overlooking a sprawling vineyard, breathing in the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The air was perfectly still. The frantic, suffocating anxiety that had defined my life for decades was completely gone, replaced by a profound and steady peace. I brought a small porcelain cup of espresso to my lips, letting the bitter, complex flavors ground me in the present moment. I was 71 years old, living a life I had once believed was entirely impossible. The local postman, a cheerful man who knew me only as a retired American businessman seeking a quiet retirement, had driven up the gravel path an hour earlier. He handed me a small stack of mail with a polite greeting. Mostly the deliveries were local bills or updates from the charitable trust I had established. But nestled between a utility invoice and a local wine catalog was a stark white envelope that felt instantly heavier than the rest. The return address was stamped with the harsh, unmistakable black ink of a United States federal penitentiary. I set my espresso down on the wrought iron table. I did not flinch. My heart did not race, and my hands remained perfectly steady. A year ago, the mere sight of my son's handwriting would have sent a spike of panic straight through my chest. Now I simply looked at the envelope as if it were a relic from a museum, an artifact from a lifetime that no longer belonged to me. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced cleanly through the paper. Trevor had filled 3 pages with his cramped, erratic handwriting. I unfolded the sheets and began to read. He did not start by asking how my health was. He did not inquire if my physical therapy had finally healed the lingering weakness from my stroke. He started as he always did with himself. The first page was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood. He described the harsh conditions of his confinement, painting himself as a naive casualty of a broken justice system. He wrote at length about the cold food, the dangerous inmates, and the crushing isolation. He masterfully wove in a narrative of betrayal, entirely shifting the blame for his criminal enterprise onto Monica. He claimed she had manipulated him, that her insatiable greed had clouded his judgment, and that he was merely a desperate husband trying to keep his family afloat. It was a spectacular display of psychological evasion. Even sitting behind iron bars stripped of his luxury suits and his false empire, he absolutely refused to take ownership of the choices that put him there. The second page shifted gears, seamlessly transitioning from self-pity to emotional extortion. He invoked the memory of his mother. He wrote that Evelyn would be weeping from the heavens if she saw her only child wasting away in a concrete cell. He claimed he had found religion, that he had spent his nights reading the scripture and reflecting on his sins. He promised that he was a changed man, completely reformed by the harsh reality of prison life. He swore that if he were given just one more chance, he would dedicate the rest of his life to making me proud. The words were perfectly chosen, engineered to strike every vulnerable nerve a father possesses. The final page revealed the true purpose of the letter, the hook hidden inside the bait. He explained that he had met a fellow inmate with connections to a high-powered appellate attorney in Washington. This lawyer, Trevor claimed, had found a procedural loophole in his sentencing. All he needed to launch a massive appeal and potentially secure an early release was a retainer of $50,000. He begged me to contact Stanley and authorize the transfer. He closed the letter by telling me he loved me, writing that a father is supposed to never give up on his son. I finished reading the final sentence and placed the papers gently on the table. The autumn breeze rustled the edges of the pages. I sat back and analyzed the emotions running through my body. I searched my soul for anger, for sorrow, or for the familiar crushing guilt that used to dictate my every decision. I found absolutely nothing. The letter was powerless. I saw the mechanics of his manipulation with total clarity. I recognized the subtle guilt trips, the weaponized memories of my late wife, and the desperate, hollow promises of redemption. For 40 years, I had allowed those exact tactics to control my checkbook and my life. I had been a willing participant in the toxic dance, always ready to absorb the impact of his failures. But the man who used to catch him when he fell no longer existed. I picked up the 3 sheets of paper and the envelope. I walked back inside the villa, moving slowly across the cool terracotta tiles toward the massive stone fireplace in the center of the living room. I had built a small fire earlier that morning to chase away the early autumn chill. The logs were burning steadily, radiating a deep, comforting heat. I stood before the hearth. I did not write a reply. I did not draft a harsh rejection or a moral lecture. Explaining my boundaries to a predator only gives them a map of where your defenses are located. Silence is the ultimate and absolute boundary. I extended my hand and dropped the pages directly into the center of the flames. The fire caught the dry paper instantly. The edges curled and blackened the bright orange flames, consuming the desperate lies, the manufactured tears, and the toxic demands for salvation. I watched my son handwriting turn into brittle gray ash floating gently upward before disintegrating completely into the chimney draft. The fire crackled, burning brighter for just a moment, before settling back into a steady, quiet rhythm. The invisible strings my son had used to control my emotions for decades were permanently incinerated in that hearth. He could write 1,000 more letters from his cell, but none of them would ever breach the walls of my peace again. I turned my back to the fireplace, walked out onto the sunlit terrace, and picked up my espresso. The coffee was still warm, and the entire world ahead of me was entirely my own. The golden hour in Tuscany is not just a time of day, it is a state of mind. I sat on the stone terrace of my villa, watching the sun dip below the rolling hills, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and burnt orange. A warm breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient olive trees lining the property, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine and roasted garlic from the village below. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean Mediterranean air, and for the first time in my 71 years, I felt absolutely, completely free. I looked down at my right hand, the hand that had trembled so violently just a year ago in that upscale steakhouse. The hand my son had pointed at while he accused me of wasting his money on useless physical therapy. I held it out in front of me, fingers spread wide. It was perfectly steady. The intensive rehabilitation I had invested in had worked miracles. I walked without a cane, I swam in the local sea every morning, and my mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. Stripping away the toxic, crushing stress of a parasitic family had been the greatest medical treatment I could have ever received. My mornings here begin with the chime of the village church bells, not the frantic ringing of a burner phone or the panicked demands of an ungrateful child. I walk down the cobblestone streets to the local bakery, where the owner greets me by name. We share a quiet conversation over fresh bread and strong coffee. The people here do not see an old man whose expiration date is approaching. They see a neighbor, a friend, a man with decades of lived experience. They respect the gray in my hair. It is a profound, jarring contrast to the country I left behind, where aging is too often treated as a disease, and the elderly are viewed as walking bank accounts waiting to be liquidated by their own blood. I walked back inside the cool stone walls of the villa and sat down at a heavy oak writing desk. I pulled a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper from the drawer and picked up my fountain pen. I was writing a letter to Stanley. It was not a legal document or a strategic maneuver. It was simply a letter between two old friends who had fought a bitter war and won. I wrote to him about the local wine, about the slow pace of the Italian countryside, and about the profound quiet that had finally settled into my bones. But mostly I wrote to thank him. I asked him to pass on my deepest gratitude to the brilliant legal team running our charitable trust back in the States. Stanley had sent me a secure briefing earlier that week detailing the Foundation's latest victories. Our organization had successfully intervened in over 50 cases of elder financial abuse that quarter alone. I smiled as I wrote down my thoughts on one particular case he had mentioned. A 75-year-old widow in Chicago, whose nephew had secretly forged a power of attorney to steal her generational home. Thanks to the massive legal we had funded, the nephew was currently facing severe state prosecution, and the widow was safe in her own house, entirely debt-free. Every single time our foundation protected a vulnerable senior citizen from the greed of their own bloodline, I felt a profound sense of validation. The massive fortune my son had desperately tried to steal to pay off his gambling debts was now actively hunting down predators just like him. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper as my thoughts drifted back to Trevor. It had been exactly a month since I burned his manipulative letter in the fireplace. I had not received another one. The profound, absolute silence from his end confirmed that my message had been received loud and clear. He finally understood that the iron vault of my empathy was permanently locked. He was entirely on his own, navigating the brutal daily reality of a federal penitentiary, without his father checkbook to shield him from the consequences of his actions. I felt no malice toward him anymore. The burning rage that had fueled my midnight escape and my meticulous counterstrike had completely evaporated. In its place was a quiet, clinical acceptance. I had spent 40 years building a massive logistical empire, moving millions of tons of freight across the continent. But the absolute heaviest burden I had ever carried was the illusion of my family. I had dragged the dead weight of my son, entitlement, and my daughter-in-law, bottomless greed, for decades, convincing myself that enduring their disrespect was simply the price of paternal love. I folded the letter to Stanley, slipped it into a pristine white envelope, and sealed it with a steady hand. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the long shadows stretching across the terracotta floor. The house was entirely silent, but it was not a lonely or desolate silence. It was a rich, vibrant peace. I did not have to sleep with one eye open, listening for the sound of my front door splintering open under the force of a steel crowbar. I did not have to hide my property deeds in a wall safe, or worry about someone switching my medications to intentionally drive me insane. My life belonged entirely to me again. I stood up and walked back out onto the terrace holding a glass of local red wine. The sun had finally disappeared, leaving behind a spectacular twilight sky, dotted with the first early stars. I raised my glass to the fading light, to my old friend Stanley, to my late wife Evelyn, and finally to myself. I had survived the darkest, most insidious betrayal a father could face, and I had emerged on the other side completely unbroken. They tell you that when you get older, you naturally become a burden to the people around you. They condition you to step aside, to shrink quietly into the shadows, and to blindly hand over the keys to your life, simply because your hair has turned gray. But the predators who prey on the elderly always forget one crucial, fundamental thing. There is absolutely nothing more dangerous in this world than a man who has nothing left to lose except his own self-respect. My son sat across from me at a restaurant table and demanded that I stop wasting his money. So I made a decision. I decided to use every single penny of my own money to buy the most valuable thing in this world: my freedom. A week later, Stanley sent the Foundation's first annual report. It did not arrive as a victory speech. It contained audited figures, case summaries, and the names of independent directors who would continue the work even if I became ill or died. The organization had funded emergency representation in dozens of guardianship and property cases. In several matters, the accusations against family members had proved unsupported, and the lawyers had helped restore communication without litigation. In others, forensic reviews uncovered forged deeds, diverted pensions, or relatives using medical claims to seize control. That balance mattered to me. The Foundation was not designed to treat every adult child as a predator. It was designed to ensure that an older person's voice was tested fairly rather than erased by age money or family pressure. I signed a final succession instruction appointing no relative friend or single lawyer as permanent controller. The board would rotate. Grants would be reviewed under published standards. Every account would remain subject to audit. Then I added a handwritten note for Stanley. The company I built had depended too heavily on one father's willingness to rescue one son. The Foundation had to be stronger than that. It needed rules capable of surviving the emotions of the person who created it. I sealed the report and placed it beside the letter I had written earlier. Outside the village, bells marked the evening hour. I walked back to the terrace where the last light rested across the vineyard. My peace no longer depended on Trevor remaining silent, Monica remaining distant, or Stanley remaining alive to protect me. It rested on documented boundaries, independent people, and decisions I had finally made for myself. The empire was gone. The freedom it purchased had been built to last. If you have ever had to find the courage to stand up to toxic family members and reclaim your own dignity, please share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories